Tom Petty was a rock and roll purist. He was a craftsman, a songwriter who built a legendary career on three chords and the truth. Believing in soul over empty showmanship, but underneath that cool, southern demeanor was a fiery conviction. Petty wasn't afraid to speak his mind when he felt the heart of rock and roll was on the line, and that's where the legend begins. According to the whispers of rock and roll lore, the stories told by roadies over late-night beers, the rumors from behind the studio glass, there was a secret list. A list of celebrated, even worshipped, guitar gods who Tom Petty believed were fundamentally missing the point. Now, let's be absolutely clear, Tom Petty never published a list called Guitarists I Hate. You won't find it in any official biography or Rolling Stone interview. This is a journey into a rock and roll thought experiment. It's pieced together from unverified anecdotes and apocryphal tales that have swirled around for decades. But while the stories themselves might be myths, they paint a remarkably consistent and vivid picture of Petty's deepest musical beliefs. So, think of this not as a factual list, but as a way to understand what Tom Petty held sacred. By looking at the guitar styles he seemingly couldn't stand, we can see what he valued most: melody, honesty, and always putting the song first. From the flashy showmen to the technical wizards, these are the 6 types of guitarists whose styles clashed with the gospel of Tom Petty. Tom Petty was a rock and roll purist who believed in soul over showmanship. While he never published an official hate list, rock and roll mythology is filled with stories about legendary guitarists whose styles represented everything he stood against. So we're diving into the lore to explore the 6 players who allegedly made Tom Petty's infamous unofficial list, and what their stories tell us about his unshakable philosophy. First up, a man who, for millions, is the walking, breathing image of a guitar hero, / the top hat. The curtain of curls, the dangling cigarette, and the low-slung Les Paul, the uniform is as iconic as the riffs. When Guns N' Roses hit the scene with Appetite for Destruction, it was a full-blown cultural earthquake. They were raw and dangerous, and Slash's bluesy, venomous guitar work was the sound of the fuse being lit. He made the guitar solo a blockbuster event again, but where the world saw an icon, Tom Petty's philosophy saw a potential problem. The legend goes that Petty viewed the whole larger-than-life persona not as authentic rebellion, but as a kind of rock star cosplay. For Petty, the music had to do the talking. The image was a distant second. Slash, in this view, represented a triumph of style over substance. The critique wasn't about his skill. You'd have to be crazy to deny Slash's talent. It was about the packaging, the feeling that the myth was just as important as the music. A classic unverified story claims Petty once watched a GNR video and dryly remarked that Slash had created a Guitar Hero fantasy years before the video game existed. The burn, if true, was that it felt like a pre-packaged version of a rock star, not the messy, earned authenticity of his own heroes like George Harrison or the Byrds' Roger McGuinn. Those guys served the song. They were part of a band, not a spectacle in themselves. Think about it. In the late 80s, Petty was hitting a new peak with Full Moon Fever, an album built on clean, jangly hooks. Songs like Free Fallin' are masterpieces of beautiful simplicity. Meanwhile, Guns N' Roses were the biggest band on the planet, dealing in sprawling, bombastic epics. Petty was the craftsman, sanding the edges of a perfect 3-minute song. Slash, in this philosophical clash, was the showman, painting with a massive, dripping brush, letting the paint spill everywhere for dramatic effect. Petty's own guitarist, the incredible Mike Campbell, was the living proof of his philosophy, the anti-Slash. Campbell is a master of taste and tone, saying more with 3 notes than most can with 300. A persistent rumor from the Heartbreakers camp is that if a guitar part got too flashy, Petty would stop everything and say something like, "Let's leave the pyrotechnics to the other guys." For Tom Petty, it had to feel real. And in his worldview, the iconic image of Slash, however cool, was a fantasy that risked overshadowing the music. Next, we have the man who single-handedly reinvented rock guitar for the post-Hendrix world. Eddie Van Halen. When that first Van Halen album landed in 1978, Eruption was the sound of an alien spaceship touching down. The tapping, the whammy bar abuse, the legendary brown sound, it completely rewrote the instrument's rulebook. Ed didn't just play the guitar, he made it do things it was never meant to do. He was a technical marvel, an innovator for the ages, and, according to rock folklore, Tom Petty just couldn't get with it. Again, this wasn't personal. It was a deep, philosophical opposition to what EVH's style represented. Where fans heard explosive joy, Petty's worldview allegedly heard a gymnastic competition. The story suggests that Petty saw this kind of playing as the musical equivalent of a circus act. It was jaw-dropping, sure, but was it soul? A damning quote, often attributed to Petty but never verified, supposedly asked, "He's a great athlete, but is he a great songwriter?" Apocryphal or not, that question cuts right to the heart of Petty's beliefs. For him, the song was the sun. Every instrument had to orbit it. In this view, Eddie Van Halen's guitar was a rogue star, so massive it pulled the song into its own orbit, often causing it to collapse under the weight. Think about a classic Petty song, it's built on melody and feel. Mike Campbell's solos are so melodic you can hum them. Now think of a classic Van Halen song. It often feels like a delivery system for the riff and the solo. The solo isn't just a part of the song, it is the event. Petty supposedly saw this as a perversion of rock's purpose. He came from the storyteller tradition of Dylan and the Beatles, where virtuosity, for its own sake, was a distraction from the human story. There's an anecdote that during the recording of Damn the Torpedoes, Petty used Van Halen as a cautionary example of what not to do, pushing for lean, mean guitar parts. He reportedly hated the rise of what he called sports metal, where guitarists were judged by speed rather than emotion. While Petty publicly expressed respect for other musicians, the whispers from inside his circle suggest he saw the shred. Revolution Eddie started as a path away from the heart of rock and roll and into a dead end of technical one-upmanship. It was a thrilling ride, but for a purist like Tom Petty, it was a circus that belonged in a different tent. If Eddie Van Halen put the solo on a pedestal within the song, our next entry, Joe Satriani, just got rid of the singer altogether. True guitarist, Satriani pioneered instrumental rock, proving with huge albums like Surfing with the Alien that a guitarist could be the frontman, making the instrument sing and soar without a single word. To Tom Petty's sensibilities, this was allegedly a bridge too far. The most famous story on this topic is a legendary quip, often credited to Petty, that instrumental rock guitar is like a conversation where one person does all the talking. Whether he actually said it or not, that metaphor perfectly captures the philosophical divide. For Petty, music was a communion. The lyrics provided the story, the emotional core. Taking them away was like removing the main character from a book. You're left with beautiful scenery, but no plot to connect with. Petty reportedly saw this kind of music as technically brilliant but emotionally sterile, a clinical demonstration of skill that didn't tell a human story. It was all technique, no narrative. This belief was apparently so strong that, as the story goes, Petty would actively avoid guitar-centric festivals or award shows heavy with instrumental players. He allegedly called these events trade shows, a scathing indictment suggesting they were just a place for musicians to show off their gear and licks like competing salesmen. This highlights the massive gap between their philosophies. Satriani sees the guitar as a complete voice. His fans would argue that a song like Always With Me, Always With You is overflowing with emotion and tells a clear story. But Petty, coming from the folk rock tradition, just couldn't see it that way. For him, the human voice was the soul of the song. Without it, a guitar, no matter how masterfully played, was just making beautiful, complex noise. While he supposedly saw Eddie Van Halen as hijacking the song, he saw Joe Satriani as abandoning it completely. It was a step further down a path. Petty considered a dead end the ultimate expression of musical ego in his eyes, and the polar opposite of the band-as-a-gang chemistry he held so dear. If Eddie Van Halen opened the door to athletic guitar playing and Joe Satriani walked through it, then Yngwie Malmstein slammed the door, locked it, and set the building on fire. Malmsteen was the god of 80s guitar excess. He fused the speed of Ritchie Blackmore with the highbrow fury of classical violin, creating neoclassical shred. He played with a precision and velocity that was simply staggering, a storm of notes delivered with the stage presence of a conquering Viking for a musical purist like Tom Petty. This style wasn't just misguided, it was a parody. And this brings us to perhaps the most vicious and almost certainly untrue quote ever attributed to Petty. The legend goes that after hearing a Malmsteen solo, a baffled Petty described the sound as someone strangling a cat that had swallowed a calculator. Again, it's almost certainly a myth. But the fact that the story even exists says everything about the philosophical canyon between these two artists. The imagery is brutal but hilariously precise. Strangling a cat for the high-pitched screaming. Notes and swallowed a calculator for the cold and humanly fast mechanics of it all. It was, in this view, a flurry of notes signifying nothing. Petty's philosophy was that music is a language. A simple three-chord song can communicate profound joy or sadness. What was Malmsteen communicating? From Petty's alleged perspective, the only message was, "Look how fast my fingers can move." It turned art into an Olympic event. This approach was poison to a songwriter like Petty, whose entire craft was about stripping things down to their honest core. Malmsteen's style was all about addition and complexity, layering more and more, until it became an impenetrable wall of sound. Studio stories claim Petty would sometimes use Malmsteen as a punchline. If a take was getting too complicated, he'd sarcastically ask, "Are we sure Yngwie's available for this?" It was shorthand for everything he felt was going wrong in modern rock. It was loud, fast, dazzling, and, to him, completely missing the one thing that mattered, a human heartbeat our next guitarist represents. A different kind of sin in the alleged gospel of Tom Petty. This wasn't about speed or showmanship. It was about technology, specifically the wah-wah pedal, as mastered by Kirk Hammett of Metallic. Metallic is, without question, one of the most important heavy metal bands ever. And Hammett's solos are a crucial part of that sound, frenzied, chaotic, and almost always drenched in that unmistakable wah-wah for a purist like Petty, who believed a guitarist's tone and emotion should come from their hands. The constant use of an effect was seen as a crutch. The stories here are less about a personal dislike of Hammett and more about what he represented. In this view, the wah pedal was a shortcut, a way to add excitement and texture to a solo without doing the hard work of crafting a truly memorable, melodic line. There's an apocryphal tale of Petty walking past a studio where a young guitarist was stomping on a wah pedal. He supposedly paused, listened, and muttered, "It's a great sound, but what's he trying to say?" And that question is pure Petty. Every musical choice had to have a purpose. He allegedly felt that many players used the wah as a sonic smokescreen, masking a lack of melodic ideas under a blanket of cool-sounding noise. It's crucial to remember Petty's deep reverence for what he called the lost art of rhythm guitar. The foundation was the song and the groove. The solo was just the icing. He supposedly saw the whole thrash metal movement as an assault rather than a song, and Hammett's chaotic, wah-drenched solos were the prime example. A story likely embellished. Overtime claims Petty once saw Metallic at a festival. During one of Hammett's extended solos, he just shook his head and walked away, reportedly finding it impenetrable. He couldn't find the song inside the storm. This wasn't a shot at metal, but at an approach to the guitar. Petty valued clarity. He wanted the instrument to speak plainly. Kirk Hammett's style, filtered through the wah, was, in Petty's alleged opinion, doing the opposite. It was mumbling when it should have been singing. The final guitarist on this mythical list is the most surprising, because he's the opposite of a flashy shredder. We're talking about the Edge from U2, a master of texture and soundscapes. The Edge built U2's iconic sound on a foundation of shimmering, rhythmic, dotted eighth-note delays. He was an innovator who also chose texture over flash dots, so why would a minimalist like Petty have a problem? The answer, according to the lore, came down to the technology. Petty's minimalism was organic, a great guitar, a great amp, and great hands. The Edge's sound, in Petty's alleged view, was a brilliant but high-tech illusion, born from a massive rack of digital effects. Petty, the ultimate traditionalist, believed power came from the player, not the pedals. A great studio joke that's been passed around for years has Petty warning his bandmates against hiding behind effects, quipping, "If you need 16 pedals to get your point across, you probably don't have a point." While the Edge wasn't named in the 80s and 90s, everyone knew who was the king of complex effects rigs. For Petty, a guitar was meant to speak plainly. He loved the honest, jangly sound of a Rickenbacker or a Fender. You could hear the wood and the player's touch. The Edge was creating sounds that often didn't resemble a traditional guitar at all. He was playing the effects as much as the instrument. Petty supposedly saw this as a form of cheating, or at least a distraction from pure musicianship. A studio engineer who worked with both bands once noted that getting a guitar sound with Mike Campbell took 5 minutes. It was all in his hands. Getting a sound with the Edge could take hours of programming delays and tweaking rack units. When Petty heard this, he supposedly just smiled and shook his head. In his world, that wasn't making music. It was computer programming with 6 strings. This wasn't a critique of the Edge's talent, but of his entire approach. He was suspicious of anything that put a barrier, whether it was a persona, a need for speed, or a rack of blinking lights between the player's soul and the sound coming out of the speakers. / Eddie Van Halen, Joe Satriani, Yngwie Malmstein, Kirk Hammett, and the Edge, a murderer's row of rock's most beloved guitarists. And according to rock and roll legend, their styles all clashed with the principles of Tom Petty, but as we've seen, this mythical hate list was never about personal animosity. It was a philosophical crusade. Each of these players, in their own way, represented a turn away from the path Petty saw as true, the path of the song. He was its humble servant, and his life's work was to protect it. He saw the rise of the guitar hero as a threat. Whether it was Slash's rockstar cosplay, Eddie Van Halen's circus act, Satriani's one-sided conversation, Malmstein's calculator speed, Hammit's wah-wah crutch, or the Edge's high-tech illusions, Petty's philosophy diagnosed the same disease. The player's ego triumphing over the song's soul, his entire counter-argument can be heard in the playing of Mike Campbell, who was the perfect guitarist for Tom Petty because he understood his job was to serve the song, to add color, to tell a concise story with his solo, and then get out of the way. That, in Petty's eyes, was true guitar genius. In the end, this apocryphal list tells us far more about Tom Petty than it does about the guitarists on it. It reveals the unwavering principles of a true believer, a purist in an age of excess, and a songwriter in an age of noise. The list may be a myth, but the philosophy behind it is the very real and enduring legacy of Tom Petty. Which of these philosophical clashes surprised you the most? Do you think Petty was a righteous purist or a traditionalist who couldn't appreciate innovation? Let us know in the comments. And if you love diving deep into the stories that shaped rock and roll, be sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss another one.